Welcome to climate.edu, the podcast exploring climate action at the intersection of climate change and higher education. The nature of the climate crisis and the unprecedented speed with which the world needs to address it requires global, national, and local actions that are informed by the latest research from multiple disciplines. However, the process for publishing research can be glacially slow, to use an apt adverb. And when it is finally published, more often than not, this knowledge, this research is locked behind the paywall of one of a handful of big academic publishers. Never mind that the research is usually taxpayer funded through federal grants. It is handed over to powerful for-profit publishers who then sell it back to taxpayers through hefty subscription fees. If you can't pay for a subscription or get access through your college or organization, you are SOL. And in the case of climate change, so is the planet. Because, tragically, the majority of climate change research is locked behind one of these paywalls, often limiting how it can be applied to the wicked problem of climate change. My guest today is working to change this. For the past several years, Dr. Monica Granados has been leading the Open Climate Campaign, a global effort by the nonprofit Creative Commons to promote open access to climate research in order to accelerate progress towards solving the climate crisis and preserving global biodiversity. According to the Open Climate Campaign, in order to solve the global challenge of climate change, the knowledge about climate, research, data, educational resources, software, must be open. This issue is very close to my heart. I spent a good chunk of my career in education advocating for and supporting open education, open textbooks, and open educational practices. So it was great to get into the open access weeds with Monica. Don't worry. Don't get too far into the weeds. And also take the opportunity to promote what I think is a crucial but little-known tool for combating climate change, which is open licensing. Monica and I discuss what open access is, the truly messed up grift that is academic publishing, resources faculty who are interested in sharing their research can use to make their work openly accessible, and future directions for the Open Climate Campaign. Dr. Granados has a PhD in ecology from McGill University. She has worked on open knowledge initiatives with Mozilla, Pre-Review, and the Government of Canada. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Monica Granados. Welcome, Dr. Monica Granados, to climate.edu. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Richard, for having me.
So you work at an organization called Creative Commons. I'm pretty familiar with Creative Commons from my past work, but some of our listeners may not be familiar with Creative Commons and what it does, or maybe they just need a refresher. So can you tell us, before we get into your work on the Open Climate Campaign, tell us a little bit about Creative Commons, what the organization is about, what it does.
Yeah, absolutely. I love when I run into people where I say I work at Creative Commons and they get really excited. And so I'd love for more people to know about Creative Commons so that I get that experience. So you might know Creative Commons from a couple of different places, depending on what part of the world you operate in. If you are someone who publishes, you probably see those open licenses on printed materials. So a lot of materials that get published by national governments and nonprofits will use a CC license, so a Creative Commons license. You might see these licenses if you're an artist and you're using some photographs, or you're creating a collage. You might see a CC license on the piece of art or the piece of work. Mm-hmm. Really what these licenses do is they work on top of copyright. So, copyright keeps the material as yours, the ownership is yours. But by working on top of copyright, it gives the copyright holders a way to share their work. Mm-hmm. And give people an explicit permission to use their work. So we have a wide spectrum of licenses that range from most permissible to least permissible. Mm-hmm. We have licenses where you are putting the work into the public domain. So that's our CC0 license. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can put restrictions on how you want your work to be used. Most often, you'll probably see a CC BY license. So a CC BY license, again, gives others explicit permission to use that work, but requires you to attribute the work. So if I, for example, take a document that has a CC BY license and I, take parts of it, like take big chunks of it, outside of like what would be considered a fair use, and I use it for another product that I'm creating, I have to attribute where that original source is from. It's just a really great type of tool to make it easier to share content,
right?
To create a commons for people to be able to share knowledge and art and music. And I'm interested in the part where we talk about sharing scientific knowledge using these licenses.
Yeah. So, my experience is mostly in the education space, promoting what are called open educational resources. So, college faculty may have definitely heard of what's called OER, which are, you use these open licenses to reduce what are the exorbitant costs of textbooks for students and give faculty more flexibility.
Right.
But as you mentioned, this is, the licenses are, used for much more than just kind of educational textbooks. They involve museums, libraries, music collections, whatever. How does the licenses connect to climate change and the Open Climate Campaign?
Yeah, so I'm working on this 4-year project called the Open Climate Campaign, where we're working to make the production of climate research open as the norm. And the reality is that's not really where we are. So let's take one specific output of knowledge around climate change research, the scientific publication. That's really the medium by which scientists communicate their findings. So if you're good, the first place that science gets delivered and like new science and like new research and new innovation, it's going to get published in a scientific publication. That's really also the currency which is used to gauge scientists' productivity and excellence. So the scientific publication is really important across many dimensions, not only as a communication tool, but many scientists engage in that practice because that's the way, that they are assessed. And to access that publication, if you're another scientist, you probably will be able to read that work because you're part of an institution that will have a subscription. So like any magazine that you might read off the newsstand, you will probably have to pay for that specific magazine, that specific edition of Vanity Fair. But if you subscribe to Vanity Fair, they're gonna send it to you. So if you're a researcher at an institution, your library pays for that subscription. However, if you're anywhere outside of that institution, if you are a policymaker, if you're a decision maker, if you're a high school student, if you're a college student that doesn't have a subscription to that particular journal, you probably won't be able to read that scientific paper, that output, that new knowledge without paying a fee. And, you might say, well, when I go to read a magazine off the newsstand, I have to pay an amount to read that. However, when it comes to the publication of scientific journals, you effectively have already paid for that research being part of the tax base, because a lot of the research that gets published has been supported by grants from your national government. And so for you to have to then pay to read that is not equituable. It's not just, and prevents access to that knowledge.
It's messed up. I mean, I think if you're not part of kind of a higher ed space, hearing about the ways that academic publishers I really think kind of feed off of academia and off of faculty is like I said, it's a really unjust process that I think is due for for changing. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. But it
some
is
innovation.
Yeah, or some innovation, right. But really, kind of
absolutely
using kind of again using the funding of higher ed and grants and taxpayer dollars, and then kind of basically selling it back to people. I think if most people understood it, would see kind of the real significant unfairness inherent.
Absolutely.
But anyway, go on. I interrupt. Sorry.
No. I mean, I think that's what what you just brought up is like, it seems so inherently unfair. Like, why don't most people know about this? And that's because not many people outside of like the scientific discipline will encounter this issue. But I'll give you a very specific example where people outside of academia encounter it, and that is if you're diagnosed with a new illness and you want to go learn more information outside of what's on like WebMD, and you want to get to the primary literature, you won't be able to read about the new disease that you've just been diagnosed with, or that someone in your family has been diagnosed with. And that's when people start to encounter how unfair this system is. And so now extrapolate it to something even bigger, a problem that's affecting all of us. To get back to your question around climate change, we want to know more about, we know a lot about what's causing climate change, but there's still, new information that is coming out about the effects of climate change, especially in the ways that it's starting to accelerate, like the impacts are accelerating. So this is a knowledge base that should be accessible to everyone, to other scientists, to decision makers. And the reality is that many of them are confronting this paywall. In fact, only about 50% of scientific papers that fall under the umbrella of climate change are open, meaning that you don't hit a paywall, and 50% are behind that paywall. And so the way that it intersects with Creative Commons is that many of the articles that are open will carry a Creative Commons license. So not only are they free to read so that you're not hitting a paywall, but by having an open license, it also allows the remix and reuse of the content so that that knowledge can be spread faster and wider. But it's not the norm.
It's not. Well, yeah, it's only 50% or less, right?
Right.
And so, just to clarify, so if something has a Creative Commons license on it, the license you described earlier, you don't have to go through that paywall. You can have direct access to that, to depending on the license, to kind of see and use and repurpose that data. Which I would think. I mean, another thing about generally academic publishing of research is like the timeline, going through the kind of the large publishers and this whole process, and getting published in journals. Is it faster too? Is this route kind of faster, or does the open licensing help kind of speed up to the access to this knowledge compared to like traditional publishing?
Yeah, it can. And there is a little bit of there's a distinction between what we call free to read and then like truly open access. Okay. So you'll find that certain papers will be free to read, but they don't necessarily have to have an open license to them. So that's great. You're able to read the material, but then you don't have that explicit permission to reuse that knowledge, or like reuse your text and data mine, pull out pieces of the work and reuse it for your own work. You couldn't do a translation on it, for example. But I'll give you an example where open licenses are used to make the process faster, the process of publishing. You alluded to how long it can take. I was a former practicing researcher. I knew how important it was to publish, and I was often waiting 12 to 24 months between having my paper reviewed and revisions and decisions. you were waiting at least a year and often over a year for that work to be able to be made public. So a way that these open licenses are interfacing with speeding up the publication process is through preprints. Preprints are a version of the manuscript that hasn't gone through peer review yet.
Oh, right.
They have become increasingly popular. Actually, there was an article that recently came out in, I think it was Nature, that showed how preprints are becoming more and more popular amongst researchers, particularly after COVID-19. So we often point to what happened in scholarly communication during COVID-19, because it was this like seismic shift from these sort of like previous practices of very closed, very slow processes to recognizing that we needed access to this research and speeding up the process and opening up a lot of this information. Preprints are a way to do that. So what you do when you upload a preprint, often as soon as you have like a version of your scientific paper ready to go, you will upload it to a preprint, and often simultaneously you'll also then put it through the traditional sort of publishing pipeline to get it reviewed, et cetera. Right. But what that means is that if you have a preprint out, the work that's going behind the scenes on the publishing pipeline is happening behind closed doors. And in the meantime, you have a version of the work that is open and accessible and will often have a CC license on it. We are actually in the middle of a project where we're recommending and encouraging preprint servers and researchers and the funders of research to put CC BY licenses on the preprints so that knowledge can be remixed, reused, translated right away, and you don't have to wait until the publishing pipeline reaches its conclusion in 12 to 24 months.
Oh, so you could...
So those open...
Yes. So those are two different things. You could, submit it to a traditional publication and openly license the preprint, or is that only to open journals?
No, you can do both.
Wow.
You can do both. And many journals now have preprint friendly policies, not all. There actually is ASAP Bio and Sherpa Romeo are two resources that you can look up the policy of the journal, but the majority of them have very preprint friendly policies that allow you to have an openly licensed work on a preprint server and still follow the traditional publishing pipeline at your journal of choice.
Right. Well, great. So thank you for making that connection, and certainly, I guess Creative Commons does this work and has done it for a long time, working with, opening knowledge generally, whether it's academic knowledge or research or data, music, How did this work? This work around the Open Climate campaign is fairly new. You guys have been kind of up and running about a year and a half, as I understand it. How did this line of work get started on focusing specifically on climate research and data? What was the motivation for Creative Commons to start focusing specifically on this topic?
Yeah, I think I'll take us back to that thought experiment that we had around having access to, information about something that you're being impacted by, whether, that's, a disease, or maybe it's something that's happening in your neighborhood, and extrapolating that out to something that is affecting everyone on the planet, and that's climate change. Mm-hmm. We thought we need to elevate this conversation around access to knowledge, and what is something that is affecting everyone on the planet, although not evenly, not in the same way. There are those that are disproportionately impacted more than others, but everyone is feeling an impact of climate change, and it's going to get the impact's going to get increasingly larger. So climate change really is that is that global problem. And it came really on the heels of that phenomenon that we saw with COVID-19. In the open access and open knowledge community, we often have talked about the need, this discourse that we need to have around the fact that a lot of the knowledge that we produce is not physically accessible to the masses, and it's particularly egregious when most of it is publicly funded.
That's right.
And the fact that we need this knowledge to solve problems. And we really saw that come to fruition with COVID-19. It was a problem that was so present in everyone's lives that, this argument that we had been making for 20 years sort of finally actually came to the global discourse. And there was a recognition finally that this argument is true. We need access to knowledge. We need access to knowledge quickly. And it's particularly important when it is a global problem like COVID-19. And there was this recognition. There was, I think if you look at the number of articles that are on COVID-19, greater than 80% of those are open.
Wow.
100,000 preprints were uploaded around COVID-19 when there was zero, before 2020. The vaccine was the vaccine came from the sequencing of the COVID virus that was made openly available. And like this sort of these practices that we want them to be these like norms were implemented because there was this urgency and this global scale problem. And so on the heels of that, and recognizing like that climate change is an equally important and impactful and at the same scale, we wanted to see if we could ignite that same reaction and recognition that climate change knowledge needs to be open so that we can develop mitigations and solutions like we did for COVID-19. The development of vaccines and the development of therapeutics did arise because we started literally from almost zero knowledge about this novel coronavirus to fully sequencing it, having a vaccine, whose efficacy depended on other external factors, but therapeutics that have been also very, very promising.
So it sounds like during this window where the world was open to this approach for good reason, right? We're dealing with this novel virus, and it was global in nature. But it sounds like that COVID kind of subsided for the most part. That the window didn't stay open. That kind of, as you're saying, the climate research, you were 80% with COVID, and you're kind of back to hovering around 50 for climate research. Is that how you would characterize that brief moment of unity, and then a kind of a return to kind of the copyrighted and the traditional way of approaching research?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. In fact, actually, so one of the things that we've learned from sort of this like COVID experiment in scholarly communication was that many of the publishers did open up the publications around COVID-19, but they were temporarily opened. Right. So like they didn't have, open like CC licenses or open licenses. And so after, like you said, this window closed, many of them actually were put back behind a paywall.
Oh, the COVID research?
The COVID publications, yeah. Okay. So they were only temporarily opened. This is the challenge that the open access movement has been facing for many years, and that is that there is a very strong external force that is propped up by this assessment system that I talked about earlier, for scientists that these publications are so powerful and so important, and they're controlled by the publishers,
Right.
that it's really hard to change culture, because the incentives for researchers are to publish, and to publish in journals that are highly cited. And then the publishers have just a lot of control, because they're the ones who do the processing of putting these publications and their like version of record, and the this currency. They control the currency, even though they don't produce any of the labor or knowledge that goes into this currency. And so I think that is a challenge. And also, this, I like the metaphor of the window closing. I think if we were still in the midst of COVID, because if it hadn't subsided, or we hadn't, found vaccines and therapeutics, the problem would still be at everyone's door. And we would still have, we would still be in that culture shift of open sharing and rapid publication. And we don't see that in climate change either, right? We know it's a really big problem.
Mm-hmm,
we get, we have much hotter summers. I live in Ottawa. The canal that people have skated on for hundreds of years, it's the second year in a row that people haven't really been able to skate on the canal. Like, these are sort of, these are the small impacts, especially in the global north, that we're feeling. And it's just not knocking on people's doors the way that COVID-19 did. And so I think, existentially, people know it's a problem, that climate change is an issue, but it's not, they don't feel it the way they did for COVID-19, where like they couldn't go to work, or sadly, some people, lost loved ones. Yeah. It was very real. And I think part of the work that we want to do is to show, let's change the culture of sharing around climate change research before we feel it, before it's the kind of problem that, where we react after the fact instead of before.
Yeah.
We're trying to get ahead of it.
Yeah, I think certainly there's the COVID was a different beast, in a sense that, like you said, these impacts were right there. People were catching the virus, and with climate change, it's emerging. Certainly we can see it happening, but I think it's often hard to get your arms around if you're just a regular Joe, or if you're, it's hard to see oftentimes the urgency behind it, because we are oftentimes responding to future, a future that we can't really see. And so I was going to ask you how this is going, with your first year and a half. What kind of progress have you made with the Open Climate campaign? What are you seeing? What's the response been from, these academic institutions, as well as other, research and science institutions, where oftentimes the incentives may be a little different, maybe not there to kind of share your work. Are you making headway with this project?
Yeah, I think we are. And we're discovering a lot too, and then adapting our communications and the support that we're providing through the campaign as we discover barriers. What we've discovered depends on like our, the target group that we've been talking to. So when we talk to researchers, for example, the researchers have a lot of power. They have a lot of power to publish preprints. They have a lot of power to retain their rights and put open licenses, CC licenses on their work. But the resistance that I encounter when I talk to researchers with the narrative that, you're working on the world's greatest problem, your work and your outputs need to be open so that we can leverage that into mitigations and solutions, is a powerful one, and it resonates, and they want their work to be open. And then the resistance that I encounter is, but it's going to cost too much money. And many researchers are unaware that there are multiple pathways to make your work open that does not require you paying an article processing fee to make your work openly accessible.
Oh, the cost is that they think they're going to have to pay as researchers.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And I hear that time and time again. I'll give a talk at a conference specifically, doing outreach to researchers, and they say, "This is great. I believe in it, but show me the money." And that's when I say, actually, you know what? Here are multiple pathways. You can preprint, your work. And with preprints, you also then can get feedback early on in the process. You get to plant your flag on this is the specific topic that you're working on. You can put the preprint on your CV while it's going through the traditional publishing pipeline. There's many advantages of preprinting. You also can deposit a version of your manuscript into your institutional repository, making it open. And so there's these pathways they actually don't really know very much about. There's no one who's been doing that advocacy also, because there's no incentive to do that advocacy, certainly not if you're a publisher, and there's no mandate for someone to be doing that advocacy to researchers. And so discovering that has really shifted a little bit of our strategy to go and get this message out, recognizing that who can we connect with at libraries, for example, that can talk to researchers and say, article processing charges is one of the options available to you, but there are 2 to 3 other options that are no cost to you. So that has been really revelatory, and slowly making progress, because the base of researchers is really big and really diverse, and figuring out ways of how can we reach researchers and tell them about different options.
Is that a institution by institution kind of contact? Are you kind of going and knocking on doors and meeting with librarians and other folks involved in the research institutions? Is it do you usually use other mechanisms? What's the way that you're connecting with these faculty that might be open to openly licensing their research?
Yeah, so far it has been at the institution level, but we, starting to explore, what if we reach out to the societies. So for example, the ecologists have a society, limnologists have societies,
right.
And doing the advocacy through those channels, especially because they're well respected, and are the organization that in a way represents this group of researchers in that particular subdiscipline. But that's hard to do, because it is so, disciplines are pretty disparate. They're spread out. So, in addition to that type of advocacy, we also know that having open access policies can be a powerful way to change behavior, and a way to also communicate these different avenues to open access of publications. So a lot of the work that we're doing is in creating these open access policies. So we've been working with national governments, funders, and we're looking to work with environmental organizations as well, to create open access policies. So what does that mean? So national governments are the major funders of this research. As I mentioned, you contribute, you're part of the tax base, you contribute money through your taxes, and part of that money, amongst many other different expenditures, gets set aside to for research. And then a part of that parcel is for grants to researchers at different institutions in your country. And what we're working on is creating policies that require the grantees, so those that get those grants, that in order to get that grant, you have to follow the policy, which requires you to publish a version of that scientific paper openly.
Got it.
And so whether that's through a preprint, whether that's a deposition of your, of a version of your manuscript in an institutional repository, or whether it is through publishing in an open access journal that may or may not have an article processing charge. And so we're working, with the holders of these of the money, those that control the money, and putting rules around money that will initiate a culture change around open sharing. And in those communications, it's not just about make your work open by any means necessary. These are the recommendations that we have, so that it's an equitable policy that doesn't lean on just paying for making your work open, but supports all of these other routes to open access that are less costly and often more equitable.
That's great. I mean, I've found in my past work with, open educational resources that, both of these were tools that were really effective. Just the engaging with faculty, especially faculty talking to other faculty about opening a textbook in this example, right? Or developing a textbook that's openly licensed, as well as, attaching these conditions to grant money, which is optional, right? You can take it or not. And then, but
right.
Because it is generally, publicly funded, oftentimes in education, that you're just saying, hey, we paid for it, so we want to see it when you're done with it. So here's some open licensing policy. Have the national governments that you've been talking to and the other large environmental organizations and funders, what's the response been? Have you felt a pretty positive response? Is it mixed bag? Is it a learning process?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the organizations that we've spoken to, whether it's a national government, a funder, or environmental organization, really believes in those, in the premise that if this research is publicly funded, it should be openly available to the masses that have paid for this research. It's sort of it's a moral imperative. They
Right.
believe in that, but they face the same barriers that researchers face and the open access movement face, which is that there's so much inertia in the present system, and it's really hard to change a system that has been churning away for 100 years or a little bit less, since at least when we moved to digital publications. But this system of publishers having a lot of control means that they face a lot of resistance to change the system. And so in the same in these like listening and engagement sessions that we have with national governments, the publishers will also participate in these conversations and argue why the present system is working well or should stay in place. And so, it's hard to move the needle when this has been the system for a really long time, and there's someone advocating for the persistence of the status quo. So I'm really optimistic.
Open access journals have grown, and seems like more and more faculty or researchers are agreeing to or see some kind of benefit to publishing in open access. Is there what did it take for them to do that? Are the incentives different for some institutions? Is it some faculty are just that's just what again, that moral imperative, right? It is working to some extent, and why is that? Why are some researchers choosing open access journals? Is it generally they do a mix of things, how have the incentives changed for them?
Yeah, I would say it's probably less of the incentives, and I think the publishing options have changed. And
Mm-hmm.
so many of the journals that were not open access now have a route to open access, but through an article processing charge. So where the researcher is paying to make that work open.
Got
And
it.
so for a well-funded institution, it's not an issue. For many institutions, actually, they have a pot of money that they allocate for researchers to make their work open. But if you're from a smaller institution, even within, say, the United States or within Canada, for example, publishing a article as a scientist, especially in the natural scientist, publishing a paper in Nature is the pinnacle of success. When I was a researcher, that's what I wanted to do. I knew that was a key to be able to continue successfully in the academic route.
Right.
And now if you're required to make it open or you want to make it open, the article processing charge for Nature, I think the last time I checked was $8,000.
Lordy.
So yeah, $8,000 is, that's a student salary even in United States or Canada. It's the salary of a researcher in somewhere in an institution in South America, in Brazil. I've spoken to researchers there who have said we could never pay that. And so even though there's more options, like part of the work that we're doing at the Open Climate Campaign is to make sure that non-APC routes are equally viable and equally rewarded and known and embedded in these policies. Otherwise, we're just returning back to the same system where the publishers have the power. They're making work open, but they're charging exorbitant fees to make that work open. We really want the power to be in the knowledge production, the knowledge producer's hands,
right?
To have a viable option to make it open that is not a non-APC route.
So you go directly to faculty, which, as you said, is challenging. You work on these larger government funder or institutional, policies around open. Do you talk directly with the publishers? Are you working with these mega publishers and academic publishers as well?
Yeah, and I have to say, we have spoken to them, and it's really interesting to get to work with sort of like this. When you're a researcher, they're the people behind the curtain. Mm-hmm. Who have a lot of power and control, not only in your fate but in like the fate of knowledge production.
Right.
And I've had really friendly conversations with many of them. We are embarking on something we called an unbinding project. It's based on a proposal from Peter Suber, who has been in the open access movement for some time, and it used to be at the Harvard Library. And the idea is that you would, through various means, get a corpus of papers, so like a group of papers that you have deemed to be extremely important, and that this corpus of papers needs to be open. It's foundational research. It has some of the discoveries around climate change, for example, and many of the initial papers on climate change are still behind a paywall. I often give an example around how we mobilized around chlorofluorocarbons and the effect on the ozone as an exemplar for how humanity can mobilize to address a global problem. Mm-hmm. And the original paper that discovered the effects of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, on the ozone, or on O3, is still behind a paywall.
Wow.
So thinking about those types of papers and putting them in, gathering them up, and then assessing which publisher has published each one of these, let's say 500 papers, and going to the publisher and saying, you have published one of the most seminal papers in climate change, it's still behind a paywall. This knowledge needs to be opened. Can we negotiate to have this work opened? And so we're in the middle of working to create that corpus and figuring out sort of what's the best methodological approach to creating the corpus of 500 papers.
What is that negotiation with them? Is that paying some kind of?
It may. I mean, we're hoping that because open access is such a bigger part of the discussion that we hope that they will open it because it's going to be such a small percentage of the total number of papers that they publish. It'll be, the 10 papers that belong to them will be, 0.0001% of the total papers that they have in their entire corpus. And, we're hoping too that, that they're going to earn goodwill from this work. We'll work with them to publicize this, the partnership and their involvement in opening up these fundamental publications, and that it won't require us paying a fee to open them. It could, if we have a couple of papers where it's not negotiable, it's something that we would be willing to discuss. But the idea is that, we're making the argument that many of these publications have been open for many years. Like the paper on chlorofluorocarbons is a paper from the 1970s,
right.
So you have made a lot of money already from that publication. Don't
be greedy.
I think it's time to free it. Yeah, it's time to free this publication or, these 10 publications. The conversations we've had so far, we've been building relationships with these publishers. I mean, the majority of them do believe in the access to knowledge. They also they're just part of the system that makes the knowledge accessible in a way. And, it was encouraging to know that, many of them, of the ones that we spoke to so far have been interested in this project and open to collaboration. I
have a few more questions for you. So I know, governmental organizations, as organizations like NOAA or NASA, I believe already have open policies. So then they do a lot of the kind of big research projects, especially around climate. A lot of foundations and funders, maybe not a lot, but I know some are, adopting open policies as well. So when we're talking about climate research, your work with kind of open climate campaign and climate research, how big a slice of that research is within kind of what we call academia, within higher education, and how much would you say is somehow outside or external to that through the government or external organizations? Are you mainly working with higher ed, or is it a small chunk?
That's a really good question. Like how the distribution of sort of the knowledge production around climate change.
Yeah, and the focus of the work that you're doing, right? So, I know there's probably a lot of very kind of smaller projects, and just like all research, right? It happens at higher ed, but in a kind of a way of kind of the impact that you want to have. How much is it through higher ed, and how much is it through something that's outside of a higher ed?
A lot of it is happening at higher ed, and through the strategy of implementing national policies. In some cases, and in certain countries, it will hit both. So, for example, the U.S. federal government has policies around open access because of what we call the Nelson Memo, that requires now that all government agencies have open access policies. So that is at the national level, at the U.S. government level, but it covers the NIH and the NSF, who give out grants to academic institutions. And so those are the most impactful kind of policies, because you get to affect not only the research that happens within the government, but also the grants that go outside to academic institutions.
Yeah.
I do think that the academic institutions will take longer. It's much easier to put in like a government-wide policy that then affects like the internal research, or what we call like intramural research. It's harder to put in policies that will affect academic institutions, because they are all independent and they each will have their own policy.
Yeah,
and
that's
so,
right.
I mean, I do think that's something that we need to address. And there's a project called Helios, where institutions are coming together to talk about like, how do we operationalize like getting open access policies at all like institutions of higher learning in the United States, and doing it in like a systematic way, and having policies also that align, so that you don't have different policies, especially because there's so much collaboration amongst researchers across institutions. So I think the lower hanging fruit is the intramural research, so the government research. It's great when we can have a policy that also affects the grants that go out to academic institutions or institutions of higher learning. But I do think that they produce a lot of knowledge, and that it's just harder to implement policies because of the structure of institutions, and they're autonomous, and that's great. For many reasons, it just makes it harder to do advocacy and to them.
Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting, I don't know if it's a conundrum is the right word, but we have this really, speaking of the United States, this enormous footprint of higher ed across the country through research institutions, Research One, the big research institutions, 4 years, community colleges, but very, very few mechanisms for coordinating the work of these institutions on something like as challenging and existential as climate change. So, in my work with Open, and in my conversations with organizations that may not, be aware of open licensing or open data or open research, it seems like a really great opportunity to encourage more of that. Not just openly licensing your work, right? But using kind of openness in that way to have more kind of collaborative projects between institutions or researchers, right? So to kind of make it more visible and also accelerate what we have to do, right? So using open to kind of accelerate knowledge creation around climate change or mitigation or adaptation and things like that. Is that at all a part of this work or of interest of the institutions that you work with?
I mean, yeah, certainly. That's the argument. Around it's around not only just making work open, but openly licensed. And that, that's sort of like that second layer of advocacy that we do, is talking about the need to make things accessible, but also, it's more than just making them free to read. Is like, how do we enable the possibilities of open licensing? We've been talking a lot about this specifically around like artificial intelligence and like what that technology can do, particularly with open content and openly licensed content. So that is the part of that narrative, and it also goes beyond just climate change. This is we chose climate change because it's a really concrete example of why knowledge has to be made open. But, we should be doing this for the multitude of challenges that we have in this world, the multitude of, of diseases and other challenges, why don't we have a campaign for like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or that's affecting, thousands of people. But I think the argument that we're making is that, when we bring this conversation to somebody who is funding research, the policy doesn't say only open climate change research. It will be, we're using climate change as a lever to get in a policy that's going to open all research. It's going to require open for all of the outputs, regardless if it's around climate change or not, because that really should be how we're working. There shouldn't be a paywall to knowledge that has been produced, like morally, but certainly also ethically, in terms of knowledge that's already been paid for by the same people you're asking to pay again. Like, it's such an injustice.
Right.
It's, it keeps me up at night.
Yeah, you can feel the unfairness. I think most people can identify with that. So I have two more questions for you. The first is, what are your plans for the coming year? What you did mention before, how you kind of shift a little bit based on kind of what you're finding out. So you are discovering as you go along and as this project develops. But what's coming up for you as a focus area? Is this, staying kind of where you are and just kind of continuing to build awareness, and or do you have any other directions that you want to take this project?
I would say like two things are on my radar for 2024. The first is we're going to start, we're looking to work with environmental organizations to do some of this policy development work, but also to talk to them about opening up some of their resources, including their educational resources. A lot of environmental organizations will contract out work to develop educational materials that then they use, and a lot of them are all rights reserved. So we're looking to partner with these environmental organizations. We'd come in absolutely free of charge and provide thousands of dollars worth of consulting to help them open up these educational resources around climate change, around biodiversity, so that they have a greater impact ultimately, because they can be spread out further, translated, remixed, and reused. So we're really looking forward to developing those partnerships. And the second is really sort of around, I think, just elevating the footprint or the presence of the Open Climate Campaign, particularly in the dialogue around climate change. So one of my major goals for this year is to attend the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties, so COP29, and bring together other organizations and individuals working at the intersection of open and climate to elevate the discourse around what role does open play in tackling the climate crisis? Because I think it really hasn't been part of the conversation. There's a lot of elements, of course, and unfortunately so, of climate change. It's very multidimensional. It's a complex problem, but I haven't heard a lot about the role that open plays, and I want to elevate that discourse into the coverage that COP gets, the conversations around open. So we've recently brought in a communications person to the team, and we've been connecting with other organizations, as I mentioned, at the intersection of open and climate, so that we can have this sort of consortium of people that are bringing this conversation to the fold. Because I think ultimately, that needs to be part of the climate change conversation. But I do, have always had this vision or goal to elevate the conversation to the around open access to the public. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, that most people really don't know about this injustice until they're faced with it.
Yeah.
And luckily, most people won't be faced with it unless they're in the academic institution where they, something bad happens. But I think if more people knew about this injustice, that there would be pressure to change the way that we do scholarly communication. That's the same pressure that was put on publishers during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's, there was a letter that was signed by over a dozen science advisors and chief science advisor asking publishers to make the work open. And they felt that pressure because the world was putting that pressure on. And I think that it's a
lives are on the line, right?
Yeah. And I think if we can have this be a bigger part of the public discourse, we can put more pressure on the system and move that inertia towards openly sharing our work.
I'm really interested to hear how that goes. I feel I've been just through my interest in climate change and moving into that area for professionally, conversations around openly licensing work. So particularly, it was because of my interest in educational materials or curriculum or programs and things like that. And it's not just the kind of injustice, but it almost like a relief for a lot of folks in these organizations. Like they didn't know about it, and it solves a big problem. Oftentimes, they have to figure out what's copyrighted and what they can do. But a lot of times, like, oh wow, this allows us to expand or accelerate or whatever their goals are, and they just weren't aware of it. So I think there's a lot of potential there, especially if you go to somewhere like COP where that's where everybody is, right? Hopefully you'll have some significant interest.
Yeah, that's a goal. I was there last COP, to get sort of a sense of the scale of the conference and the kinds of conversations that were happening. And there were some conversations about open, but they were pretty small. And so, I kind of want to bring this contingent to get that conversation going.
So if I'm a faculty member at an institution, I'm doing some kind of research or collecting data related to climate change, and I'm hearing about the Open Climate Campaign. What can I do as a faculty member? Do we go to your website? Are there tools or resources they can access in order to learn more and possibly look into openly licensing the research that they're conducting?
Yeah, great question. We sort of did that type of thought experiment and said, how do we equip researchers who believe in that, that their work should be open but don't know how. And a lot of the times, as I mentioned, think that the only route to do that is to pay an article processing charge. So if you go to our website, openclimatecampaign.org, and you go to our Get Involved page, we have a different section for researchers, for national governments, funders, environmental organizations. We're about to put one up for librarians, but in this scenario, you're a researcher. Mm-hmm. If you click the researcher page, you'll be able to download our action kit. And our action kit, states, here are the things that you can do to advance the goals of the Open Climate Campaign, and has links to resources on how you can preprint, how you can make your data open, how you can deposit a manuscript if that's the route that you want to go. So all of the resources we have are around no cost, no APC routes to open.
Great. So we'll put the link to the website in the show notes. They can access it. And it sounds like you've got quite a few resources to help folks move forward if they want to do that. Monica, it has been great. I've learned a lot. I really admire the work that you're doing, and thanks for being on climate.edu today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the great questions.
Take care. Climate.edu is written by me, Richard Sebastian. The theme music is by Serge Quadrado. You'll find a link to Serge's free music archive page in the show notes, where you can also find a guest bio, transcripts, and additional links and resources. You can also go to the show website at climate.edu.com. Yes, that's right. The word climate, DOTEDU.com, where you'll find other episodes of climate.edu, get news and updates related to climate change in higher ed, or to get in touch with me. If you like this episode, make my day by subscribing. Thanks for listening. See you next time.